As we come to you live from Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch, there are 2 rounds remaining in the Swiss format. Throughout the rounds, Ian, everyone's played 2 games out of 3. Game 1, the 60 cards out of the box, and then they get to sideboard. It's always important. But tomorrow, when we come back for the Pro Tour Top 8, much as we have through much of Magic's history, we're going to go to best 3 out of 5. Is there a way to adequately explain just how much importance is resting on sideboards tomorrow?
It's pretty tough to do. You know, in all formats, Rich, sideboards are often undervalued, underappreciated by Magic players. In Modern in particular, sideboards are especially important. With so many powerful decks that are doing such wildly different things, you need to come equipped with a good sideboard. And when you're headed for the top 8, you need to be thinking about playing upwards of 4 games with your sideboard instead of just 2.
Mm-hmm. So this is a format with 50 sets in it, which is the best part of 10,000 cards.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
Before we get into the specifics, if people are saying, what is my sideboard meant to look like? What kinds of cards belong in a sideboard?
Well, you definitely want specialized cards, just speaking in general in any Magic format, right?
Yep.
You want cards that are specifically targeted for your opposing deck strategy or that shore up weaknesses in your own deck. So a perfect example of that, if you think you're going to be up against decks that have lots of artifacts and enchantments, you might want to play a card like Naturalize in your sideboard. That one's pretty straightforward.
All right, so why don't we talk about artifacts? Because the one thing that everyone knew coming in was that pretty much there was going to be affinity decks. The robot menace, if you like. And in order to beat that, because it's super good game 1, indeed Randy said almost certainly it's the best game 1 deck in the format coming in. Maybe that's not true anymore with all the Eldrazi, but we'll see. But you had to find a way to beat affinity. So why don't we take a look at some of the cards that could hate on the artifacts?
Yeah, so our first slide here, this is artifact hate, and as Rich mentioned, when we say artifact hate, in many senses we mean affinity hate. Affinity, just a super powerful deck. It's what we call a linear deck sometimes, where it's very focused on one strategy, which is getting lots of artifacts in the battlefield. So looking through here, we have Ancient Grudge, classically just one of the most powerful artifact removal spells. It's a 2-for-1, it's cheap, it's instant speed, it's efficient. If your deck can play red and green, you should definitely strongly consider this card.
What's interesting about all these is they do more than one thing. They do the thing as advertised, kill an artifact essentially, but Ancient Grudge does it twice. Nature's Claim says, oh, and by the way, since they're trying to beat you up with artifacts, we're going to let you unbeat yourself by 4 life. Destructive Revelry punishes them a little bit beyond the artifact. But then we get a card that's the strange one on there, to people who aren't used to Modern, is Stony Silence. Because it sort of says, sure, you can have all your artifacts, I don't mind, which that's counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's a little deceptive, and I remember when this card very first came out, I was a little bit deceived by it as well. I was like, artifact abilities can't be activated, like, is that really that good? They get to keep all their artifacts, maybe they remove this somehow later and they still have them all. But if you actually sit down and think about it, the Affinity deck is defined by artifacts with activated abilities. You've got, Darksteel Citadel, Steel Overseer, Cranial Plating gets totally shut off. You can't move your equipment anymore.
Right.
Arcbound Ravager, of course, and the list goes on, right?
So all these cards are extremely cheap, they're extremely powerful against the Affinity deck.
Yeah, the one exception there being Shatterstorm, which
right.
you're not cheap and efficient there, but man, are you devastating when you're playing a Shatterstorm.
All right, but by and large, although there are some decks that play artifacts sort of, I might say it fairly,
right.
Only Affinity is driven by artifacts and has, a dozen artifacts on the battlefield, ideally. So let's move to something that everyone is playing, and that's lands. So let's talk a bit about land destruction.
Yeah, so there's a variety of powerful lands in Modern. A bunch of different decks make use of them, and in general, Modern mana bases are pretty wild and crazy. You've got the fetch land, shock land interaction, so some people are getting super greedy with their mana. So even though all 4 of these cards are under the umbrella of land destruction, they actually do quite different things.
Right.
So the first 2 here, Fulminator Mage and Crumble to Dust, these excel at sort of pinpoint targeting a problem land. Fulminator Mage can take out like an Urzatron, Urza's Tower, something along those lines. Or as we saw today, it's great for taking out Eldrazi Temples and Eyes of Ugin, provided the damage hasn't already been done yet. Crumble to Dust, speaking of Urzatron, is just a great way to totally extract all of your opponent's copies of a single land. usually used at breaking up the Urzatron combo, but
Right.
has a variety of other uses as well. Then we get into stuff that's a little bit differently aimed here. As I mentioned before, with fetchland, shockland mana bases, people are sometimes getting pretty greedy with their mana, and Blood Moon is a way to not only shut off abilities of special lands, but actually just totally color hose your opponent if they've decided to get too greedy.
And it's worth mentioning that that is a card that is so powerful out of the sideboard that at various points in Modern's history, players have decided it's sufficient to run main deck as a kind of catch-all sideboard strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a card like Blood Moon, you might be talking about, this is effective against 60 to 80% of the metagame to various different degrees. And when you're talking about that magnitude of decks that are susceptible to it, to some degree, it starts to look like a pretty appealing main deck card. The catch is you have to build your own deck so it's not too devastating to you.
Okay, why don't we take a look at the way of dealing with Graveyard, because this is an unusual part of the game. It's not a zone that we often interact with in our limited games, for example. So you've got a few cards here. Walk us through these.
Yeah, so these are all awesome Graveyard hate cards. Different decks interact with the graveyard to varying degrees. Classically, early on in Magic, you had Reanimator decks that are trying to put a creature in the graveyard and cheat it out by reanimating it. You still have that in Modern with things like Goryo's Vengeance, for example. But a lot of these other uses are more subtle. Relic of Progenitus might be used to shrink down Tarmogoyfs, might be used to stop a Snapcaster Mage flashback. Similar, Grafdigger's Cage can, stop all kinds of stuff from coming back.
Now, a zone that is in use pretty much all the time, creatures. They live on the battlefield. Sometimes they die in ones and twos. Sometimes you really want them dead in bunches. So let's look at sweepers. This is the way to get a whole ton of cards off the board. What are your favorites in Modern?
Yeah, so two of them are here. Anger of the Gods, awesome at sweeping away creatures and stopping death triggers like Kitchen Finks persisting back, or now Matter Reshaper also is a big one. Engineered Explosives, also great at sweeping away tokens, but great at sweeping away non-creature permanents as well. So that's very useful there. Could have put a lot of cards on this slide. You've got like Damnation, Pyroclasm, various type of creature sweeping effects. But yeah, these are two of my favorite ones, and I think they're representative of a whole class of cards.
Okay, and then what about specialty cards? Cards that are really, really niche.
Yeah, when we were putting this together, Rich, there were a whole bunch of cards that didn't really fit together under the umbrella of one category, but they're all powerful cards that do really cool and unique things in Modern. So here they are all together, and they're very different from one another. Spellskite just does a ton of work. It can redirect spells. It's awesome against Infect. It's awesome against a variety of different decks. Keranos, God of Storms, awesome in control mirror matches. Just want to call out Gear per Aether Grid real quick here. It's an awesome card out of the sideboard of Affinity and also the Lantern control decks we've seen recently. So lots of cool stuff there.
There really are so many sideboard cards, and that's the world of sideboard as we head down the stretch here at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch.